Hi, welcome to Choose Your Own Adventure, Paper Mache Dragons. I am Candice Greene. This is just finishing up my 6th year of teaching. This is my first time presenting a lesson, so I'm excited about that. I teach for North Kansas City schools at the middle school and the high school, where I teach 6th and 7th grade in an adaptive art class, and at the high school I teach Art 1. Really quickly before I dive in, I did want to show you that all of the materials that I'm going to go over today are located in the handout/materials folder of my session folder. So you'll see the handouts that I created. This is how my kids submitted their work. This is the presentation I'm going through. And this is the actual lesson plan. So you can see the listed materials. You can see the objectives that I used. I did go off of the new visual art learning standards that are being adopted this year, not off of the old ones. But if you are still using old ones, you could change these very easily. You can see the steps and examples and stuff like that. So that's the whole lesson plan. Back to this. Okay, so why did I choose to do paper mache during a pandemic? This is a weird idea that I had. We were adjusting our lessons to eliminate shared materials, and we were trying to still incorporate sculpture, but we kind of made the decision to stay away from clay, especially at the beginning of the year. And it just, all the quarantining, it just seemed like that would be kind of a nightmare to keep up with. So I decided to do paper mache because I could still get that sculpture in, could still teach some of the same skills, and it was budget friendly. This is just the stuff that I ordered. You can kind of go through this and adapt it to help you as you need to. I had 2 classes of 24 kids, so it cost me about $2.50 a student. That's not including the acrylic paint we used to paint them, because I already had that, so I didn't include that in the numbers here. But everything on here is adaptable, and if you change the lesson, you could change the materials to fit your needs. The only thing I would suggest on this list that you absolutely need to buy are these. These are deli containers I got off of Amazon. They come with a lid. This is how I was able to do paper mache during the pandemic while we weren't sharing supplies. So every kid had one of these. They had one in their cubbies already. They had supply kits, and we use these for water containers. But then we also use them. I kept the paper mache paste in here so every kid could have their own container. They came in a pack of 48. So 1 pack was enough for all of my classes. And I just mixed my paper mache paste in a blender so that it would go really, really fast. You could do without the balloons if you really wanted to. And the metallic paint, that was just kind of something extra that I did for the kids. But you definitely want to buy these. And you can have stuff donated. You could have more things donated if you want to. I did end up having to buy some extra bed sheets because we ran out. I think it was like $10 extra there, but Walmart has them for pretty cheap, or you could thrift them. So yeah, these are the materials for this lesson. These are some books that I purchased. You absolutely don't have to use them. This book is from the artist who inspired the whole lesson that I wrote. His name is Dan Reeder. He also has an online blog called Gourmet Paper Mache, if you wanted to look that up too. And this one I bought, it's just a fun book, and it just has information about dragons, and you can see like where they come from, their origins, what their eggs look like, and things like that. So both of these I got on Amazon. Okay, so diving in here, these next slides are exactly what I shared with my kids. I'm just going to move through them pretty quickly because you can always go back and read this stuff later. We talked about what dragons are, where the lore started. We watched this video, which kind of dives more in depth into how cultures and geographical location changed the myth of dragon. Even though all over the world we all have myths about dragons, they're all different based on where you're from, which I think is really interesting. Then we talked about dragons in pop culture and just gave examples of dragons that we know of from video games and books and movies and things like that. And the kids talked about the different ones that they're interested in. This is a huge, very deep rabbit hole, so just be careful. I did a lot of work trying to pare things down to make it less overwhelming, but you could spend days going through all the different dragons that there are. Then we talked about additive versus subtractive sculptures. So additive is when you start with a core and you add to it, also known as an armature. We talked a lot about armatures. That was one of our vocabulary words, and building things up. A lot of paper mache, that is what you do. You're building up. We did talk about subtractive, even though this lesson doesn't really hit on that. If you made it with other materials, you probably could get both in there, but we did not. And I just showed them some examples, so those are there. We also talked about scale and proportion and how it's important to create convincing artworks. Things need to make sense in relationship to each other. Okay, this I am going to play for you guys. This is the guy I was talking about earlier, Dan Reeder. He is the inspiration for this lesson. I saw this video. I don't really know how I came across it, but I was just blown away and so interested in his technique and how you can dress up paper mache to make it even a high school level activity. Okay, so you can see from that video, just his process is really interesting, and it definitely is more intricate than a typical paper mache project, which I really, really enjoyed. And I think it's cool to show kids that this thing that you did when you were a kid, we can take that and we can build on it, and we can continue to make really, really fun stuff and get better. So these are the levels that the kids were able to select for the project. So one thing that I've been working on really hard this year, after some advice from my mentor teacher, was just trying to incorporate more choice into my lessons and helping with engagement and things like that. So I geared this whole entire lesson to feel like that beginning of a video game when you first started up. Technically more like an RPG game, but when you have to like build your character and you have to select your difficulty and all of those pieces is the feeling that I was going for. And so I had our first step to be choose your difficulty. And so there were 3. Standard was create a dragon egg. The egg had to show texture, so it had to have some kind of scales or pattern on the outside, and it had to open up. Then there's heroic. Heroic had to create a dragon egg that was cracking open and some piece of the dragon was coming out. And the kids got to choose which part that was, but it did have to show texture and it had to be proportionate to the egg, and the pieces that were sticking out had to make sense in proportion and scale. So then there's legendary. And that one, they had to create both a dragon and an egg. The dragon could fit inside the egg, like kind of like the video, or it could be a completely separate thing. Again, it had to show texture, it had to show scale and proportion. So whatever egg they made had to make sense. It either needed to look like that dragon laid the egg or that dragon came out of the egg, one or the other, but it had to make sense. And this one, I also wanted them to show movement in their sculpture. The kids really loved the names for these and they all wanted to be legends. So a lot of them started here, and as we were working, they kind of adjusted their expectations and ended up at heroic, which is fine. I think that's really good to adjust and learn how to problem solve as we go and say, okay, this thing's not working, let's try something else. And I let the kids do that with this project, and I would suggest doing that as well. Then we had to choose our class. This is the part that sucked me in and took me a very long time to get through. And I spent hours paring down this information to try to present it to the kids in a way that wasn't overwhelming. So there are far more than 6 classes of dragon or types of dragons, far more. But I had to give them options without giving them too many, and it wouldn't fit on one handout. And so this is what I came up with. These are the most common classes of dragons that you will see in like mythology and pop culture currently. So there's Eastern, Western, sea serpents, Hydra, Wyvern, and then fairy dragons. I included the steps for the project on the front of the handout, and on the back were examples, so photo examples of the different types. So you could see the Eastern dragon doesn't really have wings and it's more serpent-like. You could also see what their eggs look like, because that's really important, especially because the egg is such a big part of this lesson. All 3 tiers had to make an egg. Once they figured out what class they wanted, they had to assemble their character. So this was something I struggled with because I wanted originally the kids to just create a concept sketch. And then after thinking about it for a little while and knowing my kids, I knew that for some kids that was going to be really overwhelming and a struggle. And so what I came up with was this handout that I made to be used in Schoology with Cami, which is an extension. It's a PDF editor. So if you don't have that, you would maybe have to do this a little bit differently, and that's fine, but I included the handout anyway. So I made this a Schoology assignment. I linked it to Cami, so the assignment opened in Cami for them, and then they could copy and paste their photos onto the PDF straight from Google. And then I was able to download those and print them for the kids. So I had them kind of Frankenstein their dragon, and they could research that one kind and find like, I want the head of this one, or I want the wings of this dragon, and put them all on this handout. And then we used tracing paper to combine them into one concept sketch. So this was my example here. This is the handout I put together. I chose the fairy dragon, and I only used the body pieces. I told them they only had to use the body pieces that they actually needed. So like I needed the egg, and I had planned on having the wings, part of the tail, the feet, and the head sticking out, which I adjusted as I went because I decided that I really didn't like the way it looked. And then this was my concept sketch that I traced. So you can see the butterfly-ish wings. I have the feet sticking out of the bottom, and I have this head sticking out of the top. And I even drew on my scale pattern. So that was my original idea. This is what my dragon ended up looking like. So I did not include the head or a tail, but I do have the wings. I decided to have the wings coming out of the back instead of the sides so that it would balance. But I did do the little feet. So this worked really well for my kids. They liked the tracing. It wasn't overwhelming. It gave them the opportunity to come up with something really cool without a lot of pressure. And we focused more on the 3D side of things than focusing on the 2D side. So one thing that I did, I just mentioned this, was I had my kids only fill out the part of this handout that they needed. So if they were just looking for an egg, they were just looking for an egg. You could obviously have them do the entire thing. That's not a big deal. It's whatever works for you in your classroom if you're doing this. I did give my kids parameters because I had limited storage space. So we talked about the show Forged in Fire. Some of them had seen it, so it was a nice connection talking about how if they miss their parameters, they're completely kicked off the show. They don't even get to participate in judging. So parameters are really important. And I put it in my rubric that if they missed parameters, I would take off points. So your dragon or egg must be between 6 and 9 inches tall. And between 5 and 7 wide. I'm going to make that smaller the next time I do this because these still got pretty big. So it did work though. And you could obviously, if you have the space, you could make it bigger. But this was a decent size, but it took a longer time than I thought. So making them smaller, I think, will speed up this whole unit. Here we talked about what an armature is, how it's the skeleton of your sculpture. I did not show them this video, but you could use it. She uses like a piece of cardstock that she builds foil around, and then she wraps in newspaper and then masking tape. So it was a little bit of a different process than what we did. For my kids, I used balloons to make the eggs, and then for dragon parts, we used crumpled up foil that we wrapped in masking tape and then paper mache. So here's the list of materials for building an armature. I demoed this first, and I wish that I had done just making the egg first. That's something that I'm going to do differently. I would definitely suggest splitting your kids up for demonstrations based on what tier they're doing and what body parts they need to make. It just makes it easier so that you're using time wisely and no kids are bored or confused because they're not doing that thing. So that's something that I would suggest, is only demoing things for kids who are actually doing them. So not everybody actually needed a whole armature, and I would not do a whole class instruction the next time that I did this lesson. Here's some examples of the armatures being made. You can see this one's fully covered in the masking tape. She's got this covered, but now she's using wire to start the armature for her wings. After the armature comes paper mache. It's just like any other paper mache lesson. You cut newspaper strips, you blend the glue, and they dip their strip in the glue, and then they apply it to the surface and smooth it out. One thing is that if you do the cloth layer like I did, the smoothing part isn't so important because it's going to be covered up and they're going to have a different texture over top of it. But if you're only going to do the paper mache, you definitely want to make sure they're building up those textures as they work. I made the kids do at least 4 layers, but I also made them check with me before they pop their balloon. And I told them that you had to be able to like squeeze it in and not really move. And that meant that it was thick enough, because the balloon popping will warp their sculpture if it's moist or if it's not enough layers. These are just the paper mache procedures we went over. Even though they're high schoolers, they're still like giant children. And so I made them use a scrap piece of paper to cover the table, and they had a paper plate that they had to keep their sculpture on while they were working. We used these cups as like a base or a stand that they could rest their eggs on top of. That worked really well. Trying to work as neatly as possible, having all your materials ready before you start paper macheing so that once glue's on your hands, you're not constantly going back and forth and washing your hands for no reason. Keeping the sculpture on the plate at all times, I just said that. Then I made them keep that scrap paper and all of the materials in their cubby or on the storage shelves all together so that they had it every day. And then I also made them clean the tables every day. These are some in progress paper mache. So you can see this armature is not quite ready yet, but they did start on their egg. While they're waiting for things to dry, they could be making details out of air dry clay or wire and tape. So things like feet or teeth or spikes sticking out, the tongue, those kind of things we did with air dry clay, and they were hot glued on the paper mache layer before we did the final cloth layer. The wings are just floral wire wrapped in masking tape. If you need it to be thicker in parts, you could cover it with foil and then do the masking tape. And I had them do each individual piece like a finger, and then we taped them together to form this over here. So the wire and the tape's basically like the bones of the wing. And here's, you can see her wings right here. This is an armature where she's adding the details. Once everything is assembled and glued together and you have all of the details added, the very last layer is cloth. So it's old bed sheets. I would suggest a white or a light color and all the same color, because that way the cloth actually becomes the primer and you won't have to paint everything with white paint before they get started. So after you add everything together, you can tape it on or hot glue things on. Then we do the cloth mache. So you cut it down into like small strips, or you could literally cut out the scale pattern that you want. You can fold it, bend it, whatever it is to create that final texture that you want. And you're going to dip it in watered down Elmer's glue. One thing that I decided to do after getting started with this was I had my kids continue using the paper mache paste for the cloth for everything except their wings, and that worked really well. So you could almost just completely eliminate the Elmer's glue from this whole lesson if you wanted to. The paper mache paste worked very well. We did use the Elmer's glue for the wings, and we had to do them in one whole piece. So they cut a piece of fabric that was exactly the size that they needed to cover the whole structure or armature of their wing. And then you dip it in watered down Elmer's glue so that it's not so thick. And then squeegee it off, the extra, and then drape it over the wing and kind of smooth it down onto the bones. And we had to do one at a time. It had to completely dry, and then they would go back and do the other one. If your wings were like not like mine, you probably could do both, but you want to have it draped in a way so that it dries how you want, because once it dries, it doesn't move anymore. So I draped this wing this way, and then I smoothed it down onto the bones, and then I made it this dip down a little bit here, and I let it dry that way, and that's how it came out with this wing texture. There's a whole page in the book about wings. There's a bunch of stuff, like you can see him do it in the videos where he draped it, and then once it was all dry, he cut down the wing. So like you can see, I cut this down to make this shape of the wing the way that I wanted it to be here with scissors, and it cuts really easily even after the glue's applied and dry. But the way I explained this to my kids was the armature is the skeleton, the bones, the paper mache is like the muscle, and then the cloth is like your skin. And so that's how I explained it to them, to think about it as we were working for it to make sense. Because a lot of them were still like, wait, why do I have to do this last layer? This is where you add the texture. This is the skin. This is a student example after she had her wings added and her scales. Okay. Painting is pretty simple. It's just like painting anything else. You can have them just go in and paint. You could do a base coat if you need to prime it, but if you're using the white or light bed sheets, you really don't need a primer, which for priming, I just used white acrylic paint. You can pick like a main color for the dragon and kind of paint everything, and then go back in and start adding highlights and accent colors. Like you can see this thing was painted all this blue, and then he went back and added that like lighter blue and the white to highlight. You can also do a watered down layer of black to kind of antique it afterwards and make it have that aged like leathery kind of a look that a dragon would have. I did not apply a clear coat and seal mine. You definitely could. It would just be like Elmer's glue or Mod Podge or something like that. Mine didn't need them. So this is a in progress painting. he did the heroic level, and you can see he started with this like red color, and then he mixed his highlights and started going back in. So these are finished projects. I had a class that was all 8th graders taking Art 1 for high school credit, and then I had a class that was like mixed grades of like mostly freshmen, but a couple sophomores and some seniors sprinkled in. So this was my most successful one right here. She's just fantastic. She's an 8th grader, and this was a freshman, but I just loved the texture here. And the way she used the gold paint to highlight that texture, I thought was just wonderful. Here's some more finished work. Oh, there we go. So I can get out of the way. This one I showed a picture of before both of these, but I love the movement and the fins. I think it's really fun, and these extra details, and she even painted the wire. This was another kid. She got quarantined in the middle of this assignment, which was just not fun for her, but she bought her own air dry clay, her own bag, and because of the circumstances, I let her use the air dry clay as the final layer as opposed to the cloth, and I think that it still worked really well for her. I wouldn't suggest doing it for everyone just because that makes this project so much more expensive, but it did turn out nicely. Here's some more of my freshmen. Like these are air dry clay, these spikes and the tongue, and they were all hot glued on before we did the cloth layer. And this is one of my kids, the few of them that only did an egg. Okay, so things that I would do differently if I were teaching this again, which I will be. For that first level where they just made an egg, I'm going to make them also do some writing. Creative writing, just like, where did the dragon go? And like writing a short story about what the dragon was like that lived in that egg and what they're doing now, or something along those lines. Or writing a poem, possibly like decoupaging their writing inside of the egg, I think would be really fun. So I'm definitely going to incorporate some writing. When you get started with this lesson, it is easiest if you just have everybody, no matter what they're doing, start making their egg. And as they're doing that, start pulling kids based on what they've decided to make and demoing specific things for them, as opposed to doing a whole class demo. It kind of is like, well, duh, I'm going to do that anyway. But for whatever reason, I was like, oh, well, I'll just show everyone how to make an armature. And it just didn't work out the way I wanted it to. So next time, and I was doing this by the end of this lesson, where I was like only calling over kids that needed wings, and I was only calling over kids that were using the clay. But I'm going to start that from the beginning next time. Everybody's going to start with the egg, and then I'm going to start individualizing the instruction from there on out. Do not have the kids cut their eggs open until the cloth layer is done. I let my kids do it before the cloth layer, and not really sure why, but the paper mache paste, the moisture and the pressure, then applying that layer of cloth warped the egg, so that most of them ended up where like the top didn't fit back on correctly, and they were really like, Mrs. Greene, what do I do? Oh no. And I was like, it's fine, we'll figure it out. But next time, definitely my kids will not cut their eggs open until they are completely dry and they're covered in the scales at the very end. And then I already talked about this earlier, but I'm going to adjust the size parameters. I think I'm going to make it smaller. This lesson took about 4.5 weeks, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that bad, but I think it could have probably been 3.5 weeks. So I think making it smaller, setting goals along the way of you have to have exactly this much done. Once we got about 2 weeks in, they were kind of over it, and they weren't working as quickly as they could have because they didn't want to get their fingers sticky anymore, which I get. So just trying to compress and use every ounce of time correctly so you can get through it as fast as possible, because this is one of those projects that could drag on forever if you let it, but it could be done faster. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining my session. I hope that this lesson is something that you can adapt and use in your classroom. If you have any questions, I am hosting an unconference session, so you could come to that, and I am more than happy to go more into detail to something. I was trying to kind of go through it as quick as I could and hit all the major points so that you don't have to sit here forever listening to me. But thank you so much, and I'll see you at the unconference session.